The carrier times Resolute times died at 0347 hours, and nobody on the command deck of Station Helios said a single word. They just watched the blip disappear. Admiral Yara Chen stood with her arms at her sides and her jaw locked shut, and she watched the last carrier group of Earth's 3rd Defense Fleet vanish from the tactical display, one ship at a time. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was just a light going out. And then another. And then 3 at once. And then silence, where a fleet of 62 ships used to breathe. Blip, blip, blip. Gone. Her communications officer, a young man named Reyes who had not slept in 31 hours, turned from his console and looked at her like a dog looking at its owner after something breaks, like he was waiting for her to tell him it was fixable. She did not tell him that. She walked to the observation window instead. Luna sat below them, gray and patient, and unbothered, the way dead things are unbothered by the business of the living. The conclave ships were out there past the moon's far edge, past the debris field that used to be Admiral Goretti's strike wing, past the wreckage of 3 years of fighting. They were not rushing. They had no reason to rush. They had dismantled 31 civilizations before Earth, and not one of them had made the conclave hurry. Chen pressed 2 fingers to the glass. The glass was cold. She pulled her hand back and returned to her station. "Get me Geneva," she said. The bunker under Geneva smelled like recycled air and burned coffee, and the particular human smell that comes from 40 people sharing a space and pretending they are not afraid. The UN Emergency Council had been in continuous session for 9 days. The table was covered in paper, actual paper, printed reports. Because 3 cyber strikes had taught everyone not to trust screens for anything important. Chen joined by transmission. Her face appeared on the wall screen, still in her duty uniform, still with the hollow look of someone who had just watched 62 ships become debris. Director Osei, who chaired the council, did not waste time. "The motion is on the table," he said. "Conditional surrender to the conclave. Negotiated terms. We preserve civilian infrastructure. We preserve a portion of the population." He paused. "We stop losing people." The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when everyone already knows the vote, and nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. 9 votes for, 4 against. Chen was one of the 4. She did not make a speech. She had watched too many speeches die in the last 3 years to believe in them anymore. She simply said what she knew. "Their terms have never once produced a surviving civilization," she said. 31 species took those terms. Ask them how it went." "We cannot ask them," said a man named Beaumont, representing what was left of the European bloc. "That is precisely the problem." "Yes," Chen said. "It is." The vote was taken, 9-4. The resolution passed. The official record of the session noted the vote, the time, the names of the dissenting members, and in a field marked times additional comments, which most members left blank. Chen's 3-word entry. "We don't kneel." The conclave gave them 6 hours to broadcast formal acceptance of the terms. Those 6 hours were the quietest 6 hours Earth had experienced in 3 years of war. The orbital defense platforms that still functioned were silent. The remaining warships held position, and did not fire, and did not move. The cities that had not been struck were dark, conserving power, waiting. In a monitoring station on the edge of the Helios array, a junior analyst named Priya Vasquez was on hour 14 of a 16-hour shift, reviewing long-range gravitational data. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that made your eyes feel like they were full of sand and made you dream in numbers on the nights you actually got to sleep. She was running a standard sweep of the outer system, routine, mechanical, the kind of task a person does with half their brain while the other half thinks about whether there is any food left in the break room when she saw it. A gravitational anomaly. Edge of the system. Deep past Neptune. Past the scattered disk. Out in the dark where nothing was supposed to be. It was not large. On her display it was a small irregularity. The kind of thing that gets generated by instrument drift or cosmic background noise or a dozen other boring explanations. She almost moved past it. She didn't. Something about the shape of it was wrong. Natural anomalies had a randomness to their edges. This one was too clean, too deliberate, like something very large was hiding behind a door that didn't quite fit its frame. She filed a report, flagged it priority medium, which was the highest she was authorized to flag anything without supervisor approval, and her supervisor was in the middle of the surrender transmission prep and had told her 14 times today not to interrupt unless something was on fire. She sent the report to the queue. The queue was 847 items long. She went back to her data. The Conclave Supreme Legate was named Vorsan, and he had done this 31 times. He stood on the command bridge of the carrier times Ascendant Principal times and looked at the tactical display of the Sol system and felt the particular mixture of efficiency and boredom that came from a task repeated without variation. The humans had been interesting, briefly. They had lasted 3 years longer than the projection models expected. Their tactics were unorthodox in ways that had required him to adapt twice, which was more than any previous species had managed. But they had reached the end. They always reached the end. His communications officer informed him that the 6 hours were nearly elapsed, and no formal acceptance had been transmitted. Vorsan noted this without expression. He had not expected acceptance. He had learned, over 31 iterations of this process, that some species needed the clock to fully expire before the weight of reality settled on them completely. It was a psychological mechanism. They needed to feel they had held on until the very last second. As if the second mattered, he gave them the full 6 hours, and then 30 minutes more, because he was not without patience. When the transmission came, it was not what he expected. It was not a capitulation. It started with a fishing village on the coast of Iceland, an old man standing in front of a camera someone had propped on a boat railing, the sea gray and heaving behind him. He spoke in a language the translator identified as Icelandic. He was not a politician. He was not a soldier. He was a man who had survived 3 years of war by being stubborn and who had something to say. He said no. The transmission cut to a classroom in Nairobi. A girl who could not have been older than 12 in a school uniform that was torn at the collar, her chin up, her eyes steady. She said no. A farmer in Vietnam, standing in a field that had been half burned and was already beginning to grow back. A mechanic in Detroit, with grease still on his hands. A grandmother in Mumbai who laughed when she said it, like it was the most obvious thing she had ever been asked. A retired general in São Paulo who sat in a plastic chair in what was left of his garden and said it with a smile that had no happiness in it whatsoever. No, no, no. The transmission had been stitched together by Earth's remaining communication relays over 4 hours. It had no single author. It had no organizing committee. It had no official government backing, because the official government had voted 9-4 for surrender. It was just people, from everywhere, that still had power and a camera, saying the same word in 300 different languages. It ran for 40 minutes. Vorsan watched it once. He watched it again. His tactical officer stood at his station and said nothing, because the tactical officer had learned, in 7 years of service under Vorsan, that there were moments when speaking was the wrong choice. This was one of those moments. Vorsan watched it a third time. He was not sure why. He told himself he was analyzing it for strategic content, for any sign of military posturing or hidden communication. That was not why he was watching it. The grandmother in Mumbai laughed again. He closed the file. Prepare bombardment coordinates, he said. Primary population centers first. Then, infrastructure. The tactical officer began the preparation sequence. At the edge of the Sol system, past Neptune, past the scattered disk, in the deep dark where Priya Vasquez's unread report sat in a queue of 847 items, the gravitational anomaly began to move. Chen was in her ready room when the bombardment order was confirmed by intelligence intercept. She was sitting at her desk with a cup of cold coffee and a report she was not reading, and the notification came through on her command screen, and she read it and set the coffee cup down very carefully, like she was afraid of spilling it, which was not something she was actually afraid of. She had known this was coming. She had said it in the bunker. She had put it in the official record. We don't kneel. The problem with not kneeling when someone is about to step on you is that you still get stepped on. She thought about that for a while. She thought about the 62 ships that were debris now. She thought about the pilots she had known by name, the ones she had promoted, the ones she had argued with at mission briefings, the ones who had been alive 72 hours ago. She thought about Admiral Goretti, who had gone out with his strike wing into a wall of conclave fire and bought Earth 11 days with his life and the lives of everyone who flew with him. 11 days. That was what it cost. She did not cry. She had cried in the early months of the war, when each loss still had its own shape. 3 years later, the losses had accumulated into something too large to cry at individually. It was like trying to cry at a mountain. She stood up. She went back to the command deck. "Status," she said. "Conclave Vanguard is repositioning into bombardment formation," Reyes said. 200 ships. Estimated first strike on Earth in 4 hours. 14 minutes. "Our assets?" Reyes looked at his screen like he was hoping it would say something different than it had 5 minutes ago. It didn't. 3 frigates. Katun, São Paulo, Endurance. Carrier times Honshu, operational at 40%. 11 repurposed mining vessels with railguns fitted. He paused. "And us." Station Helios was a command and monitoring platform, not a warship. It had point defense systems and 2 missile banks that were down to 30% capacity. 14. Chen said. 14, Reyes confirmed. Against 200. She stood at her station and looked at the tactical display. The conclave formation was clean, professional, arranged with the kind of precision that comes from doing something so many times it becomes muscle memory. They had done this 31 times. They knew exactly how it went. Behind her, a secondary alert chimed on a low-priority monitoring screen. An automated update from the outer system sensor array. Flag escalating a report that had been sitting in a queue. Nobody looked at it. Chen leaned over the tactical display and traced the conclave formation with one finger, not touching the screen, just following the shape of it. 200 ships. She had 14. She thought about the fishing village in Iceland, the old man in the gray sea, the 12-year-old in the torn uniform. She straightened up. "All hands," she said, into the ship-wide channel. Her voice was level in the way water is level, not because nothing is underneath, but because everything underneath has found its balance. The conclave is moving to begin orbital bombardment of Earth. We have 14 functional assets in 4 hours. I am not going to tell you we can win this. I am going to tell you we are going out there. She paused. That's all. She clicked off the channel. Reyes was looking at her. She looked back at him. Plot intercept courses, she said. All assets. At the edge of the Sol system, the gravitational anomaly was moving at a speed that should not have been possible for anything with mass. It was moving the way a stone moves when it has been held for a very long time and finally released. It was moving like it had somewhere to be. Priya Vasquez's unread report item, 211 of 847 inches. The queue, still unread, still waiting, had a subject line that said, in plain technical language, that a gravitational signature of unknown origin and significant mass was accelerating toward the inner system. The queue had 636 items ahead of it. Nobody read it. Outside, the conclave fleet kept moving, and in the dark between the stars, something old and patient and full of a debt that had been building for 40,000 years came burning toward the Sunday. The frigate times Khatun times launched from its dock at Station Helios 18 minutes after Chen gave the order, and its captain, a stocky Pakistani woman named Fatima Raza, who had been a cargo hauler before the war, and a warship commander for 2 years and 6 months and 4 days, watched the station fall away behind her and thought about rice. Specifically, she thought about her mother's rice, the way it smelled, the particular pressure of steam lifting the lid of the pot in the kitchen of the apartment in Karachi that was probably rubble now. She didn't know. She hadn't been able to reach her family in 6 weeks. The communication networks in that region were gone, or jammed, or both. She thought about the rice because she was terrified, and thinking about the rice was better than thinking about the 200 ships waiting for her at the edge of the inner system. All stations ready, her tactical officer reported. Good, Raza said. The times, Khatun times, moved. Chen watched them go from the command deck of Station Helios. The 14 ships spread out from their docks and holding positions in a pattern that looked, on the tactical display, less like a battle formation and more like 14 things that had decided to walk towards something very large and very dangerous, because the alternative was standing still and watching it arrive, which was not, strictly speaking, wrong. Time to contact? She asked. At current approach velocity, 3 hours, 40 minutes, Reyes said. She nodded. The mining vessels were the slowest. They had been built for hauling ore between the asteroid belt and the processing stations at Mars, and their engines were enormous, but their acceleration was gradual and ponderous, like convincing a mountain to move. The railguns bolted to their cargo frames looked wrong. the way a weapon always looks wrong attached to something that was built to carry, and not to fight. Their crews were miners and engineers and cargo workers. 3 of them had any prior military experience. The rest had signed up in the last 6 months. In the last year, as the war ground closer, and the difference between civilian and soldier stopped meaning what it used to mean, Chen had met some of them. She remembered a man named Bautista, a cargo engineer from one of the Mars stations, who had shaken her hand in a docking corridor and said, with the flat certainty of someone stating a fact rather than making a decision, "They're not getting to Earth while I'm still flying." He was out there now, in one of those slow, enormous mining haulers, moving toward 200 Conclave warships. She looked away from the display. She had learned, in 3 years, not to count. The Conclave Vanguard detected the incoming Earth forces with no particular concern. Vorsan's tactical officer reported the intercept course of the 14 remaining human assets, listed their classifications, and projected the engagement outcome in numbers that were effectively 0 on any scale the Conclave used to measure military significance. Vorsan gave the report the attention it deserved, which was very little. He was more interested in the bombardment schedule. The preliminary targeting had been completed by his strategic team primary nodes first, the industrial and communications centers, the network hubs, the largest population concentrations, not because the Conclave was cruel. Cruelty implied an interest in suffering. The Conclave was efficient. The targeting was efficient. The result would be efficient. 31 times, this sequence had produced the intended outcome. A species with enough residual population and infrastructure to be resettled and processed, stripped of the specific characteristics that made them dangerous, and folded into the Conclave's resource network. It was, in its way, a kind of mercy. The species survived. In pieces, in quiet, in service, but they survived. Vorsan told himself this regularly. He had told himself this 31 times. He believed it. First bombardment wave in 2 hours. His tactical officer reported. Proceed on schedule, Vorsan said. Chen's 14 ships hit the outer edge of the Conclave formation at a range that made no sense tactically, because the only tactic that made any sense was impossible, so there was no reason to observe normal tactical caution. The Khatoon Times fired first. Her missiles were a type the Conclave had seen many times in the previous 3 years and had developed countermeasures for 18 months ago. But they were what she had, so she fired them, and some of them got through and struck the hull of a Conclave destroyer. And the destroyer listed and vented atmosphere, and did not explode but began to drift. One ship, drifting. The Conclave responded with the minimum force required. That was the thing that Chen's tactical officers noted in their logs. Later, those who survived to write logs. The Conclave did not get angry. It did not escalate beyond what was necessary. It simply applied the required pressure to remove the obstacle, the way you apply pressure to a splinter. The frigate Times Endurance Times took 3 direct hits within the first 11 minutes and went dark. The mining hauler Times Bautista's Pride Times Bautista had named it that himself. The original registry name was something corporate and forgettable. Punched a railgun slug through the side of a Conclave cruiser at range, and then took a beam weapon, hit amidships, and broke apart into 5 large pieces and a cloud of smaller ones. Chen watched this on her display. She did not look away. There was a thing she did, in moments like this, that she had never told anyone about. She said the name of the ship in her head, not the registry number, the name. Endurance. Bautista's Pride. She said it once, silent, and then she kept working. It was not a prayer exactly. It was more like a receipt, like she was keeping a record that she would carry somewhere, and she was not sure where, but she was keeping it. Endurance. Bautista's Pride. The Dea. They're punching through us, Rhea said. The formation is. I see it, Chen said. The Conclave formation had separated. Most of the fleet was now engaged with Chen's 14 ships contained them, was the better word. The way you contain something small and annoying, while the important work continues elsewhere. 20 ships had broken off and were already inside Earth's orbital space, running the bombardment approach. They're beginning their run, her tactical officer said. The voice was professional. The hands on the console were shaking. Chen watched the 20 ships accelerate toward Earth. She had 43 years of memory packed into a body that weighed 61 kilograms and had not slept in 22 hours. and all 43 years of it were screaming at her to do something. Anything. Something. She had nothing left to do. The first bombardment strike hit the eastern Pacific coast of North America at 0619 hours. The strike was not nuclear. The Conclave did not use nuclear weapons. What they used was worse in the ways that mattered. It was surgical, it was quiet, and it left the infrastructure standing. The infrastructure was useful. It was the people that needed to be reduced to manageable numbers. Chen did not watch the strike on the surface camera feeds. She kept her eyes on the tactical display. "Keep firing," she said, to every ship still capable of firing. "Keep moving." It was a sensor operator on the damaged carrier times Honshu, times who finally read Priya Vasquez's report. His name was Cho, and he was reading it for the wrong reason. He had pulled up the long-range sensor queue looking for something, anything, that might be usable, some debris field or gravitational quirk that might provide cover for the times Honshu's times approach. And he was scrolling through items at speed because there was no time, and he almost scrolled past it. He stopped. He read it again. He read it a third time, and his hands stopped moving, and he sat very still in the way. People sit very still when something has happened to the part of their brain that manages movement. The gravitational anomaly Vasquez had flagged 14 hours ago was no longer at the edge of the system. It was past Jupiter. It was moving at a velocity that his instruments registered as impossible. Because it was. The instruments were not wrong. Something with a gravitational signature equivalent to approximately 2 million metric tons of mass was moving through the inner system at a speed that violated several things Cho had been taught were not violable. He looked at the shape of the signature again. Not an asteroid. Asteroids didn't move like this. They didn't decelerate. They didn't adjust their approach vector in real time the way this thing was adjusting, subtly, by small degrees, like something that knew where it was going and was lining itself up with precision. He opened a channel to Station Helios. "Admiral Chen," he said, "we have something on long-range sensors." Chen looked at the data Cho transmitted and said nothing for a long moment. Something was coming in from the outer system, past Jupiter now, moving fast, moving with intent, moving in a way that nothing she knew how to classify moved. "Can we identify it?" she asked. "No classification match in any database," Cho said. "Human or captured, Conclave." She looked at the shape of the gravitational signature on her display. It was enormous. "Is it heading for us?" she asked. There was a pause. "No, Admiral," Cho said. "It's heading for them." She looked up at the main display. The Conclave formation. 200 ships, 20 of them currently executing an orbital bombardment of Earth. She looked back at the anomaly. It was past Jupiter and still accelerating. Reyes turned from his station and looked at her. His eyes had a question in them that he did not know how to put in words. She saw it and she did not have an answer for him, so she did what she always did when she did not have an answer, which was to find the next thing she could actually do and do that instead. "All ships, stay in formation," she said. "Keep pressure on the flank." But she kept one eye on the anomaly. It was moving the way things move when they are very certain of something. Vorsan noticed the anomaly 12 minutes later. His long-range sensors were better than anything Earth operated, and the anomaly had been on the outer edge of their detection range. And his sensor teams had filed it as a natural occurrence, a drifting mass from the outer system, and moved on because there was no reason to think otherwise. There was now. His senior sensor analyst came to him directly, which was unusual. Analysts sent reports through the chain. They did not come in person unless the thing they were reporting was too large or too strange for a report to contain it properly. The analyst put the data on Vorsan's personal display and stood back. Vorsan looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. The mass, the speed, the directional precision, the way it was coming in not from a natural orbital path but from a specific vector, a chosen vector, aimed at a specific point in space that happened to be the center of his fleet's current formation. "Classification?" he asked. "No match," the analyst said. "We have run the signature against the full Conclave xenographic database. There is no registered species with this type of vessel." Vorsan kept looking at the data. 31 civilizations. He had processed 31 civilizations. He knew the vessel signatures of every species currently in Conclave space, every species on record, every species in the historical database going back 600 years. "No match. Alert the fleet," he said. Defensive formation. The analyst left. Vorsan remained at his display, past Jupiter, moving with perfect calm. Something that had no name in any database the Conclave had ever compiled came toward them through the dark. It did not slow down. It did not signal. It did not do anything except move, steady and enormous, and absolutely certain, like something that had been waiting a very long time and was done waiting. Vorsan had a feeling he did not have a name for. He had never needed a name for it before. In 31 engagements, across 200 years of personal command experience, in every military situation he had ever navigated, he had never once felt what he felt now. Looking at that display, watching that thing come, he felt it then. He told himself it was tactical uncertainty. He was a very experienced commander. He knew he was lying. It came out of FTL wrong. There was no deceleration burn, no transition wake, no energy signature, of the kind that every spacefaring species produces when they drop from faster-than-light travel into normal space, the specific electromagnetic fingerprint of a drive system bleeding off its accumulated energy. Every ship Chen had ever seen come out of FTL looked the same at the moment of arrival. A flash, a shimmer on the sensor array, a brief bloom of heat and radiation that faded as the drive cycled down. This was not that. One moment there was nothing between Earth and the Conclave Vanguard, except vacuum and debris. Then there was something. It did not arrive. That was the word Cho used later, in his after-action report, and then crossed out. Because times arrived, times implied a journey with a visible ending. What it did was closer to the way a word appears when you suddenly remember it present, whole, and clearly having existed the entire time even though you couldn't see it a moment before. It was simply there. And it was enormous. The displacement wave hit Cho's instruments first, before his eyes registered anything on the visual feed. The sensors screamed, not an alarm tone, just raw data, moving faster than the display systems could parse it. Numbers cascading across his screens, gravitational readings, mass readings, EM readings, all of them spiking to the top of their measurement range and holding there. He grabbed the edge of his console. The times Honshu times shuddered, not from a strike, from the wave. The wave was physical, a compression in space that moved outward from the point of arrival at a speed just below light and hit the carrier like a slow slap from a very large hand. The lights flickered. 3 crew members who were not holding on to something fell. Cho looked at his visual feed. The ship sat between Earth and the Conclave formation the way a door sits in a frame. Not blocking in the sense of geometry, space is large, and the Conclave formation was spread across thousands of kilometers, and no single physical object could geometrically block all of it, but blocking in the sense of statement. The way a person stands between something dangerous and something they have decided to protect. He tried to measure it. His instruments gave him numbers, and then he looked at the numbers and his brain declined to process them, the way a calculator refuses a number too large for its display. He tried again. Same numbers. He leaned back in his seat. He said a word that he would later not remember saying. 3 Conclave destroyers on the inner edge of the formation had been in the path of the displacement wave. They were not struck. They were simply pushed, the way a raft is pushed by a wave on a lake, steady and irresistible, and they drifted off their assigned coordinates by 60, 80, 100 kilometers before their pilots corrected. On the bridge of the time's ascendant principle, every alarm that Vorsan's ship possessed began speaking at once. He did not look at the alarms. He looked at the tactical display. The ship on his display had no designation. His identification systems were cycling through the database at maximum speed, running the hull profile, the mass signature, the material composition readings from his long-range sensors, checking and rechecking against every record in the Conclave's xenographic archive, which contained the profiles of every known vessel type from every known civilization, going back 600 years of Conclave history. Cycling, no match. Weapon status, Vorsan said. All weapons online, his tactical officer reported. Targeting is having difficulty achieving a lock. The hull material is the sensors are returning inconsistent readings. What material? We don't know what it is. Vorsan absorbed this without expression. The hull of the ship on his display was not plated in any alloy or composite or material his sensors knew how to read. They were returning the closest approximation they could manage, which was several different answers at once, which meant the answer was none of them. The material was genuinely unknown, not a variant of a known material, not a material the Conclave had encountered and classified, something else entirely. The ship's geometry was the other thing. Most ships look aggressive or passive. Weapons, placement, and hull design tend to signal intent the way body language signals intent. A ship built for combat looks like a thing built for combat. A ship built for transport looks like a thing built for transport. This ship looked like it had been built to time's last. The hull plating was not arranged to maximize weapon coverage or to minimize profile against radar. It was arranged to be immovable, layered and reinforced in the way that ancient structures are reinforced, the way the very old things, the things built before the concept of obsolescence existed, are built. Not for the next battle, for the next 1,000 years. It radiated the specific arrogance of something very old that has outlasted everything that ever tried to end it. Any signal activity? Vorsan asked. It is transmitting, his communications officer said. All frequencies, broad spectrum. Language? There was a pause, a longer pause than he expected. He turned and looked at his communications officer, who was a conclave species named Vel Ra, 10 years in this post, who had processed transmissions in 47 known languages, and had never, in Vorsan's experience, shown visible distress at her station. She was showing visible distress. The languages. She stopped, started again. I'm running it through the archive. It is giving me a match. But the match is, what language? She looked at him. Veil, she said. The bridge of the times ascendant principal times went silent in the specific way that a room goes silent not when nothing is happening but when something is happening that nobody has prepared for. Vorsan stood at his station and did not move. The vial. Every species in the conclave knew the word. Some species' histories contained it as a geographic reference. The veil had occupied a system near what was now conclave core space, 40,000 years ago, so far back that the star itself had changed in the interval since. Some species' histories contained it as a myth, the ancient ones, the Watchers, the civilization that appeared at the edge of recorded history and then receded into it before anyone could study them closely. The Velsa, who were among the conclave's founding species, had religious texts that mentioned the veil. The texts were old. The word had not been applied to a living civilization in the time since the Velsa had learned to count. The Vial were not a present thing. They were a past thing. They were the oldest name anyone knew, applied to something that had gone quiet before most current species had achieved basic metallurgy. And one of their ships was sitting between his fleet and Earth, transmitting on all frequencies in a language that the Conclave's archive classified as extinct, culture, terminated, estimated 40,000 years prior. Full translation, Vorsan said. His communications officer's hands moved over her console. The archive's translation subroutine for dead languages was slower than for living ones. It worked from historical fragments, from texts that later species had found and partially decoded, from linguistic archaeology spanning thousands of years. It took 3 minutes. 3 minutes in which nobody on the bridge of the time's ascendant principal time spoke. The translation appeared on the main screen. 6 words. The debt is old. We remember. Vorsan read the 6 words. He was a being of significant experience and rational disposition. He had commanded fleets for 200 years. He had reduced 31 civilizations to manageable states and had done so with the steady certainty of someone who has never had a reason to doubt the outcome. He was not given to alarm. He was not given to superstition or sentiment. He read the 6 words again. On the tactical display, the Veil ship had not moved. It sat between his fleet and Earth, with the specific stillness of something that does not feel the need to explain itself through movement. Its weapon systems, if it had weapons, which his sensors could neither confirm nor deny, were not visible in any configuration he recognized. The hull gave his targeting systems nothing reliable to lock onto. He had 200 ships. He looked at the shape of that hull again. He looked at the material his sensors couldn't read. He looked at a ship that had emerged from FTL without a transition signature, at a speed that violated everything he understood about how mass and energy behave. Something very ancient had used a language that had been dead for 40,000 years to say 6 words to him. He understood the words. Syntactically, mechanically, Through the archive's best approximation of the Veil lexicon, he understood them. What he did not understand was the other thing the words contained, the thing under the words, the weight they carried. He was beginning to understand it. "Get me the historical record," he said. "Everything we have on the Veil." His communications officer looked at him. "The full record, sir?" "Everything." Chen saw the ship at the same moment every other ship in the system did. It appeared on her visual feed and she looked at it, and then she looked at the dimensions Cho's instruments were measuring, and then she sat down, because her legs made a decision without asking her. She sat in her command chair and looked at the thing on her screen. It was between Earth and the Conclave fleet. It was enormous. It was like nothing she had ever seen in 3 years of war, or in 43 years of life before the war, or in any database or historical record, or classified intelligence briefing she had ever been given access to. It had come out of nowhere. It had put itself between Earth and the thing trying to destroy Earth. She did not know what it was. She did not know where it had come from. She did not know what the 6 words meant, which were now being picked up and translated by every Earth system still capable of receiving and processing them. "The debt is old, we remember." She stayed seated for 7 seconds. Then she stood up. "All ships, hold position," she said. "Do not fire, do not approach, maintain current coordinates." "What is it?" Reyes asked, which was the question everyone was asking, which was the only question anyone had, which had no answer. "I don't know," she said. She watched the screen. The Conclave fleet had stopped moving. The 20 ships running the bombardment approach had halted. The main formation was reshaping into something defensive, a tightening of ranks, a closing of gaps, the formation of a fleet that has encountered something it was not prepared for and is buying time to think. They were afraid. Chen watched the greatest military force she had ever seen in 3 years of war rearrange itself out of fear of one ship. She thought about what that meant. She looked at the Veil ship on her screen, at the weight of it, at the age of it, at the way it simply sat there, between Earth and the thing that wanted to end Earth, with no particular urgency, as if it had been heading for this exact moment for a very long time, and had known, the entire time, that it would arrive. "Get me a translation team," she said. "I want to know what language that is, and I want to know what those 6 words mean." The translation came back in 11 minutes. The language was Veil. The record classified it as extinct. Every cultural reference her database could find listed the Veil as a civilization that had gone silent 40,000 years ago. One of the oldest civilizations in the accessible region of the galaxy, a thing of myth and historical speculation, and religious reference in at least 9 living cultures. The 6 words meant what they meant. "The debt is old, we remember." Chen read the translation. She read it again. She was not a person who made large leaps without evidence. She was an admiral. She operated on data and probability and tactical assessment. She had spent 3 years making decisions based on what was in front of her and what she could calculate. She looked at the ship on her screen. She made a leap. Something had come. Something very old, from very far, had come to where Earth was dying and put itself between Earth and the thing killing it, and said, "Times we remember, times in a language that had not been spoken in 40,000 years. Whatever the debt was, she did not know. Whatever the memory was, she did not know. But something remembered. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the Conclave formation was completely still. The bombardment had stopped. The 20 approach ships had not resumed their run. The entire fleet of 200 was motionless in a way that Chen had not seen any Conclave fleet be motionless in 3 years. The Veil ship broadcast on all frequencies and waited. Vorsan read his historical record, and somewhere, in the record in a fragment of an ancient text, recovered centuries ago from the ruins of a system that had once been vile space, in a passage that referenced humanity's ancestors, in a description so ancient that the humans being described were not yet anatomically modern, not yet farming, not yet anything that their own historians would recognize as civilization. He found the debt. He stared at it. He read it again. He was quiet for a very long time. When his tactical officer asked him for the order to engage the unknown vessel, Vorsan did not answer immediately. He stood at his station with the historical record open on his display and the 6 words sitting next to it like a hand placed on a table. Steady, unhurried, not threatening, waiting. "Sir," his tactical officer said. "Your order?" Vorsan closed the record. "Hold position," he said. The tactical officer blinked. Sir, hold position, he said again. He needed to think. He needed to think about 40,000 years in 6 words and what it meant that something this old had decided, after this much time, that right now was when the debt came due. He needed to think about that very carefully. Outside, between his fleet and a planet of 8 billion humans, who had spent 6 hours broadcasting the word times no times in 300 languages, the ancient ship sat in the silence of space and waited for him to finish thinking. It was in no hurry. It had waited 40,000 years. It could wait a little longer. The Conclave moved first. Not Vorsan's ship. Not the Vanguard. A destroyer at the edge of the formation. One of the ships that had been knocked off course by the displacement wave. A young commander whose name would not survive in any record of these events made a decision that Vorsan had not authorized, based on a calculation that was not wrong by Conclave standards, which said that an unknown vessel, regardless of its signal, represented an obstacle to a sanctioned operation, and obstacles were removed. The destroyer fired. The beam weapon struck the Veil ship's hull. Or it tried to. Chen watched it happen on her screen. Watched the beam go out. Watched it reach the Veil ship's hull. Watched it do something. Dissipate was the closest word. Not reflect. Not absorb. The energy arrived at the hull and ceased to be what it had been. The way a word ceases to be a word when you say it too many times. The hull did not glow. It did not scar. It did nothing except continue to exist, unmodified, as if the beam had been a strong wind and the hull was a mountain that had been dealing with strong winds for longer than the concept of wind had existed. Reyes made a sound that was not a word. The Veil ship responded. It did not respond the way Chen expected. She had been watching the hull for weapon ports, for the kind of obvious external architecture that combat vessels display: the barrels, the emitters, the ports, the physical evidence of a weapon system. She had not found any. She had assumed, somewhere in the back of her mind, that a ship this old and this large would respond to fire, with something visible and dramatic. What happened was almost quiet. The Conclave destroyer, a 100-meter vessel, well-armored, one of the fleet's standard combat configurations, stopped working. Not in the way a ship stops working when it takes a weapon strike, with explosions and venting atmosphere and visible catastrophic failure. It stopped the way a watch stops when the spring breaks. Section by section, the drives went first, then the weapons, then the life support shifted to emergency mode, then the lights inside the ship, visible through the viewports on Chen's magnified screen, went to emergency red. The crew was alive. The ship was not a threat. It took 11 seconds. Then the Veil ship was still again. Vorsan watched the destroyer drift on his display and felt something move through his command staff, not panic, because Conclave military culture did not permit panic, but the precursor to panic, the specific silence that precedes it, the moment when every experienced person in a room understands simultaneously that the parameters of the situation have changed in a way that the existing doctrine does not address. The Veil ship had disabled a combat vessel in 11 seconds, without visible weapons. Without any apparent effort, the destroyer's crew was alive. He confirmed this with sensors, life signs stable, ship systems in emergency mode, crew contained and unharmed. He noted this, filed it somewhere in his thinking. The Veil had chosen to incapacitate and not destroy. He thought about what that meant. The historical record was still open on his secondary display. He had been reading it in fragments for the past 22 minutes. What he had found there was not reassuring in any operational sense. The Veil had been, 40,000 years ago, a civilization so advanced that the civilizations which came after them, including the founding species of what would become the Conclave, had found their abandoned infrastructure and mistaken it for natural, geological formations, had lived in their ruins for generations without recognizing them as constructed things. The ruins were too well made, too permanent, too outside the frame of reference of what younger civilizations considered possible. What the Veil had built, they had built to last. What they had done thoroughly. He thought about the hull that dissipated energy beams. He thought about the 11 seconds. He thought about 31 civilizations, processed efficiently, and about the fact that this was the first time in 31 civilizations that something had been waiting at the end of the process. "Hold all fire," he said. "That is a fleet-wide order. Nothing fires without my specific command." He opened a direct channel to the ship that had fired. The exchange was brief. He then opened a fleet-wide channel and said, in the specific tone he used for orders that were not to be questioned, that the next unauthorized weapons discharge would be treated as a dereliction of command. He closed the channel. He looked at the Veil ship on his display. It had not moved. It had not fired again. It had disabled one ship, responded to exactly the threat presented, and returned to stillness. He thought about that. Then it opened a new channel. Not a broad transmission this time. A directed signal, aimed at one specific ship in the system. It was aimed at Chen's station Helios. Chen's communication system registered the incoming signal and she told Reyes to put it through, and he did, and for a moment, there was only static. The kind of static that happens when two systems are trying to find a common ground between two very different means of communication. The electronic equivalent of two people speaking different languages and trying to figure out which words they share. Then a voice. It did not sound the way she expected. She had not known what to expect. But she had some instinctive, human assumption about what an ancient alien would sound like. Something grand or overwhelming or fundamentally non-human in its resonance. The voice that came through the channel was none of those things. It was an old voice, in the way a person's voice gets old, quieter than it once was, considered, choosing each word the way you choose where to step on uncertain ground. It was speaking in something that was not quite her language but was built from it, assembled from it, as if the speaker had spent time studying it and was using it carefully. The voice said, "We apologize for the difficulty with translation. We have been preparing for this communication for some time. We ask for Admiral Chen." 1. Reyes looked at her. She looked at him. "This is Chen," she said. Pause. "We know who you are," the voice said. "We have known since your first broadcast. Your ancestors had that same quality. The certainty. The way of not looking away." Chen said nothing. "We would like to come aboard your station," the voice said. "We need to tell you something. Not about the battle. About why we are here." The shuttle that came from the Veil ship was small. Smaller than she expected. It moved through the debris field of 3 years of war, with the careful precision of something that had been navigating for a very long time, and was practiced at finding the path through things. It docked at Helios's secondary bay. Chen was there when the hatch opened. She had 3 armed officers behind her, and she had kept her sidearm holstered because whoever or whatever came through that hatch, a holstered sidearm was a better statement than a drawn one. The being who came through was not what she expected. She had expected large. Ancient things tended, in her experience, to have the scale of the age they carried. The Veil, who stepped through the hatch, was small, smaller than Chen, who was not tall, narrow in the way of something that had once been more substantial and had been worn down by time to its essential structure. Its coloring was pale in a way that suggested a physiology adapted to low light, or perhaps simply to a very long time in space. Its eyes were large and very dark, and they moved around the bay with the alert, measuring look of something that was used to reading environments quickly. Its face was old was not the word. Finished times was the word. The way a stone is finished by a long river. All the excess worn away, and only the particular shape that it always was left behind. It moved through the bay and stood in front of Chen. It said something. Then it seemed to remember itself, and found the words in her language. "I am the last formal voice of the Veil," it said. "There are others of us. Not many. 300 on the ship. We are not a civilization anymore. We are the last thing a civilization becomes, when everything else is done." Chen held its gaze. "You put yourself between us and the conclave," she said. "Before I ask you anything else, I need to know why." The Veil was quiet for a moment. "Yes," it said. "You deserve that first." What it told her took 40 minutes. 40,000 years ago, the Veil were ending. Not in the dramatic way of civilizations that destroy themselves with war or ecological collapse, though they had experienced both of those in earlier periods. They were ending in the slower way, the quieter way, the way of a thing that has done everything it set out to do, and has nothing left that it knows how to want. Their population had declined across 8,000 years of that particular exhaustion. Their colonies had gone dark, not from disaster but from a decision, repeated individually by billions of beings across centuries, that continuing was not worth the cost. The last colony ship carried 4,000 survivors, engineers, doctors, historians, Children. They were heading for a system on the outer edge of vile space. The last viable world they knew. A last attempt at a different answer to the question that had been killing them. The drive failed. Not dramatically. Not catastrophically. A cascading series of small failures. The kind that build up over long voyages when a civilization no longer has the industrial base to produce perfectly manufactured components. The ship came out of FTL in the wrong system, traveling at a fraction of its intended speed. Its drive irreparably compromised. Its crew alive, but stranded. The system had a single habitable world. The third planet. It had life. The creatures on that planet had no name for themselves that the Veil's surviving linguists could parse. They were pre-agricultural, pre-settled. They lived in small groups, moved with the seasons, had been on that planet for hundreds of thousands of years in various forms and were currently in a form that was becoming, something. The Veil scientists recognized the specific developmental signature, a species in the long accelerating ramp toward cognitive complexity. They were nothing yet. They were not even the earliest civilizations. They were before the concept of civilization existed. The Veil colony ship put down near the coast of a large continent and began to die slowly, as stranded ships do, the systems failing piece by piece as the things that could not be repaired stopped working. The creatures on the shore noticed. They did not understand what the ship was. They were not capable of understanding what the ship was. They had no framework for understanding what the ship was. A thing had fallen from the sky, and it was large, and it made sounds, and it was dying, and they did not have the concept of alien, or spacecraft, or civilization, and they approached it the way they approached every large, unknown thing, which was carefully, and together, and with the particular caution of something that has learned that the world is full of dangerous things, and the best way to survive them is not to face them alone. They brought food. The food was wrong. Veil biology could not process most of it, but they brought it. They built fires on the shore, within sight of the ship's viewports. Fires that the Veil inside understood were intended as warmth and as signal. They did not understand what the beings inside the ship were. They understood that something was in distress, and that distress, in their experience, was something you moved toward, not away from. Several of them died defending the crash site. There were large predators in that region, and the colony ship's location attracted them, and the creatures on the shore killed predators that were not threatening them, that were too large and dangerous for creatures their size to face, without significant risk, because the large dying thing needed to not have predators around it. They had no concept of debt. They had no concept of species. They had no concept of the difference between one kind of living thing and another kind of living thing in any categorical sense that their cognitive structure could yet hold. They just helped because something needed help. The voice of the Veil stopped. Chen realized she had not moved in a long time. She was standing in the middle of the bay, and her 3 armed officers behind her were equally still, and nobody had spoken in a very long time. "The survivors," she said. "Your people. What happened to them?" "They lived," the voice said. "Not for long, by Veil standards. Fewer than 300 years. Not enough to rebuild. Not enough to call for help that could reach them in time. But they lived, and they kept records. And they sent a signal, eventually, with the last of the ship's power." A pause. "We received that signal. It took 11,000 years to reach us." "And the creatures," Chen said. "On the shore." "On the shore." The voice looked at her. "They became many things over 40,000 years, it said. They became farmers, and cities, and wars, and music, and science, and questions without answers. They became everything they were going to become, because of those extra 300 years." It paused. "They became you." Chen looked at it. The thing in front of her was the last of a civilization older than human consciousness. It had come 40,000 years and an uncountable distance to stand in this bay and say those words. She did not speak for a while. Outside, the battle was still happening. Not here. The conclave had halted around Helios, but on the other side of the formation, Chen's remaining ships were still under fire, and she could hear it in the background of her tactical feed, the voices of her crew reporting contact and damage and returning fire. She thought about the fishing village in Iceland, the 12-year-old in the torn uniform, the grandmother who laughed. She thought about creatures who didn't have a word for stranger, standing on a shore at night with fires they'd built for something that fell from the sky. She thought about what it costs to help something when you don't know what it is, and you don't know if it will help you back, and you have nothing to gain, and you do it anyway. We didn't know, she said. It was not a question. It was not anything in particular. Just a thing she needed to say. No, the voice said. You never know. That is the point of it. Chen looked at the voice for a long moment. Then she turned to her officers. Get me a line to every ship still flying, she said. We're going back out. The second phase of the battle was different from the first. Not because the numbers were better. The numbers were not better. Chen still had 14 ships, minus the 2 that had been destroyed and the 3 that were now non-combat capable due to damage, which left 9, plus the Veil ship, which was in a category she had no prior experience with and no tactical doctrine to address. Against 200, the numbers were still not a conversation anyone would call hopeful. What was different was the Conclave. They were not fighting the way they had been fighting before. Before the Veil ship arrived, the Conclave had moved through Chen's fleet with the methodical ease of something removing a minor obstruction, deliberate, professional, unconcerned, the kind of efficiency that comes from certainty. They had known what they were doing, and they had known how it would end, and they had done it accordingly. They were not certain anymore. The Veil ship moved through the formation the way water moves through rock, not destroying, not pressing through by force, but finding the places that were already open and going there, turning the fleet's own careful geometry against it. The Conclave ships had been arranged in a formation designed for planetary bombardment, not for engagement with an adversary who had come from the inside of their own perimeter. They adjusted, they tightened, and in tightening they got in each other's way. Chen's 9 ships hit the gaps. Not because 9 ships against 198 suddenly became a winning proposition, because chaos is the great equalizer, and the Conclave, which had never operated in chaos before, was discovering that the doctrine it had refined over 31 civilizations was built for a situation that no longer existed. The Times, Khatun Times, ran a pass through the flank of the formation and came out the other side, with 2 Conclave destroyers following her, and one of the remaining mining haulers cutting across her wake and putting a railgun slug through the lead destroyer's drive housing. The destroyer spun. The second one had to avoid it. The mining hauler was gone a second later. A beam weapon hit that took off its entire forward section, but it had bought the Times, Khatun Times, clear air, and Raza used it without hesitating, coming around for another run before the formation could close. Chen watched this from her command deck and said nothing for a long time and then said, Raza, break right after your next pass. Don't let them cut off your exit. Already planned for it, Raza said, over the comm. Her voice was completely level. Chen noted this and filed it in the part of herself that kept track of certain things and then returned to the tactical display. The Veil ship was taking damage. It had been taking damage since the Conclave found weapons configurations that produced effects the hull's material could not simply dissipate. The hull was extraordinary. The hull was, by the evidence of Chen's sensors, built from something that should not have been possible to build from, and should not have been possible to machine into hull plating, and should not have been possible to maintain in that configuration for 40,000 years. But it had limits. The Conclave had a combined weapons archive representing 31 civilizations of military technology development, and they were cycling through that archive at speed, trying different configurations, different frequencies, different types of energy, and kinetic impact. Some of them worked, not the way conventional weapons work on conventional hulls. But the Veil ship was large, and even a material that resists conventional damage takes cumulative punishment, from 40 ships firing simultaneously, and after 90 minutes of engagement, Chen's sensors were reporting that sections of the Veil ship's hull were showing structural irregularities, and that the ship's power output, which had been constant since it arrived, was beginning to fluctuate. It was not invincible. It had never claimed to be. It had claimed, in 6 words, to remember a debt. It was paying the debt with everything it had. Vorsan watched the engagement from the Times' ascendant principal times and thought about the historical record. He was a rational being. He had always been a rational being. His career, his record, his 200 years of command were all evidence of a mind that evaluated situations on their practical components and made decisions accordingly. He did not do things because of feelings. He did things because they were correct. The historical record was a practical document. It was a fragment of a veil text, recovered from ruins in a system that the Conclave's own founding species had settled without knowing whose ruins they were living in. The fragment described, in the spare and precise language of veil historical record-keeping, the loss of a colony ship and the behavior of the indigenous species of the third planet of the target system. The fragment did not use the word kindness. Veil language had many words that the archive's translation subroutine rendered as times kindness, and each of them meant something different. The word in this fragment was the one the subroutine flagged as closest to times kindness given without capacity for calculation, times kindness that could not have been strategic because the beings giving it lacked the cognitive framework for strategy in any recognizable sense. They had helped, not because they knew what the veil were or what the situation was or what might come of it. They had helped because something was suffering, and they were present, and helping was what you did. Vorsan had processed 31 civilizations. He had seen civilizations that were militarily strong, and civilizations that were intellectually advanced, and civilizations that had developed extraordinary technologies, and civilizations that had built structures of remarkable beauty. He had processed all of them. All of them had, in the end, made the calculation that survival within the Conclave's terms was preferable to the alternative. He had never, in 31 civilizations, encountered the word, the Vial fragment used. He had encountered it now. He watched the Vial ship take damage. He watched 300 beings spend themselves to pay a debt that no living human had incurred and no living Veil had experienced, and that had accumulated across 40,000 years of silence, patient as the dark between stars. He watched the mining haulers ore carriers, built for cargo, crewed by people who had been miners and engineers 6 months ago, run passes through his formation with the particular recklessness of people who have run out of options and decided that running out of options is not the same as running out of reasons. He thought for a long time. Then he opened a channel to the Vial ship. The Veil responded. The communication was long. Vorsan spoke, and the Vial spoke, and some of what was said was in Conclave standard, and some of it was in the recovered fragments of the Vial language that the Conclave's archive could approximate, and some of it was in the long language of silence between sentences where both parties are considering something that cannot be said quickly. When it was done, Vorsan closed the channel. He opened the fleet-wide channel. He gave the order. The Conclave fleet began withdrawing from Earth's orbital space at 1,142 hours, not in defeat. Vorsan was precise about this in his log, which was precise about everything, which was the only way he knew to keep records. The withdrawal was a strategic recalibration. The Conclave did not lose. The Conclave encountered a variable outside its existing model and adjusted its timeline accordingly. That was what the log said. What the log did not say. He had stood on the bridge of the Time's ascendant principle times and read about creatures who had never seen a star up close and probably never would, building fires on a shore at night for something dying and incomprehensible. And he had felt something in the architecture of his certainty shift. Not collapse. Shift. The way old buildings settle, not destroyed, but changed. Moved into a different alignment with themselves. He did not know what to do with that. He was not sure it was his to know what to do with. He withdrew the fleet to the edge of the system and opened a channel to what remained of Earth's government. And the message he sent was not short, and it was not simple. But its essential content was this. The Conclave's assessment of the human species was being reevaluated. The operation was suspended. The timeline for any resumption of operations was indefinite. The Conclave would be watching. He noted, in the log, that this was the first time in 31 civilizations that the operation had been suspended. He did not note the reason. He was not sure language had the right tools for the reason. He withdrew. The Veil ship held its position in high Earth orbit and stopped broadcasting and went quiet. Chen's sensors showed what the quiet meant. The drives were offline, not shut down, not in maintenance mode. Offline, the way things go. Offline, when the systems that run them have taken enough cumulative damage that they cannot run anymore. The hull that extraordinary, impossible hull had held. It was scarred in ways her instruments registered as significant structural damage in multiple sections. The ship was intact. The ship was not going anywhere. She could see the lights inside the viewports. Emergency power, red and low. 300 beings. The last of something 40,000 years old. They had spent everything they had spent 40,000 years preparing, and they were sitting in high orbit above a planet they had come impossibly far to defend, and they were alive, and they were going nowhere. Chen sat in her command chair for a long time. The command deck was quiet. Reyes was running damage assessments. Her remaining tactical officers were working through the procedural aftermath of an engagement, the administrative work of survival, accounting for ships, for crew, for what still functioned and what needed repair. Nobody was speaking unless they needed to speak about something specific. The planet below was she didn't look at the surface feeds. She knew what was down there. She knew what the bombardment had done to the places it had hit. She would look at that later. She would look at it for a long time, and it would cost her something, and she would pay that cost because it was hers to pay. Not now. Now she looked at the vile ship on her screen. She thought about what the voice had told her. About creatures on a shore building fires for something they couldn't name. She thought about the 12-year-old in the torn uniform. She thought about the old man in Iceland, standing in front of a camera with the gray sea behind him saying no, in a language that predated every nation on Earth. She thought about what it costs to help something when you don't know what it is. She picked up the comm. "Get me a channel to the Veil ship," she said. When the channel opened, she didn't ask for the voice. She didn't run through protocol or identification or any of the formal apparatus of first contact that the UN had spent 3 years building a handbook for, in case it was ever needed, which she had never read because she had been too busy with the war. She just talked. She said that she understood the ship was damaged. She said she understood that the 300 people on it had nowhere to go. She said she understood that they were the last of something, and that the last of something needs a place to be, and that a place to be was something Earth had, even now, even damaged, even carrying the weight of everything the last 3 years had cost. She said it wasn't a diplomatic offer. She said it wasn't a strategic alliance or a mutual defense pact or anything the handbook would have a section for. She said it was an invitation. She said, "Come down. There's room." The channel was quiet for a long time after that. She waited. She was not a patient person by nature. She had never pretended to be. She moved fast and decided quickly and did not like the feeling of waiting for something she could not control. She had learned patience the way most people in her profession learned it, by having it extracted from her over time until what was left was not exactly patience but its harder cousin. The ability to hold still when holding still was the right thing. She held still. The response came. The voice said, "We know. We have always known that about you." The channel stayed open a moment longer. Then the Veil ship, scarred and dark, its drives cold, its hull bearing the evidence of the last thing it had done, began to move, slowly, by degrees, the way a very tired thing moves when it still has one more thing to do. It began its descent. Chen watched it come down on the external cameras. It came in over the Pacific, low and slow. Nothing like the way it had arrived in the system. No violence, no displacement wave, no dramatic entry. Just a very large and very old thing choosing, after a very long time, to stop moving and be somewhere. It picked a site on the coast, the sensors said, Northern California, a stretch of coastline that the bombardment had not reached, that was still green and cold and edged with the sea. She thought about the shore, the fires. She thought about whether the voice had picked that site because the Veil record said it was near where the colony ship had come down 40,000 years ago. She thought the voice probably had. The ship settled. It did not crash. It was too deliberate for crash, too intentional. It settled, the way something settles when it has found the thing it was moving toward and is done moving. The dust it raised along the coast was visible from orbit for 20 minutes. Then it was still. Chen watched the cameras for a while after that. The war was not over. She understood this with the part of her mind that never stopped working. The conclave was at the edge of the system, withdrawing but not gone, watching but not finished. The suspension was not a peace. It was a pause. There would be more meetings, more decisions, more nights on this command deck staring at a tactical display and making choices that cost things she couldn't afford to spend. The conclave would watch, and the Veil ship sat on the coast of Northern California, still and quiet, and its 300 passengers were the oldest allies in the history of a species that had not known it, had allies, and outside on the shore, whatever coast, whatever night, whatever fire, something would always move toward the thing that needed help. That was the point of it. That was what the voice had said. Chen sat in her command chair for a long time. Then she stood up. There was work to do. She went back to it. In Geneva, in the bunker that still smelled like recycled air and burned coffee, Director Osei was looking at the transmission from the Conclave fleet that said, in clinical Conclave standard, that the operation was suspended pending re-evaluation. He read it 3 times. He read Chen's name in the supplementary report. He read the name of the Veil ship, which the Veil voice had provided, the returning. He read the casualty figures for Earth's fleet engagement, and then he stopped reading for a while. He thought about the 9-4 vote. He thought about the 3 words in the Times additional comments Times field. We don't kneel. He closed the report. He sat in the bunker, under Geneva, with the weight of a species still on his shoulders, alive and damaged and stubbornly present. And outside somewhere an ancient ship had landed on the shore of the world it came back to pay a debt to. And the debt was still being paid, in the way that some debts are paid not once, but continuously, by everyone who inherits the memory of what was done. He opened a new document. At the top of it he typed, redesignation of Earth's diplomatic status pending first contact protocol with the Veil. He stopped. He deleted the line. He thought about creatures on a shore at night, building fires for something dying, with no framework for understanding what they were doing or why, just the simple animal certainty that something needed help, and they were there, and help was what you did. He typed instead, statement of gratitude to the Veil Draft 1. He sat with the blinking cursor for a moment. Then he began to write. Outside, somewhere on a California coast, 300 of the oldest people in the galaxy stepped out of their ship for the first time in a journey that had taken 40,000 years, and put their feet on the ground of the world that had sent them here, and breathed the air of the place where the debt began. The sea was there. It was cold and gray and entirely unbothered by history. It sounded exactly the same as it always had.